I've seen this talk before and I really like it because I don't think we talk enough about CSS being part of progressive enhancement. You start with content, then you have HTML, then you add CSS, and then you add JavaScript. It's not just about whether or not JavaScript's available or working. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Ire Aderinokun. And what about CSS?
Thank you. Thank you. Hopefully my slides will come up. Okay, well, I'll just start while it gets up. So my name is Ire. My full name actually is Ireolua, like Akonke, Oluwashore, Elizabeth Aderinokun, which obviously is a lot. It's quite common in Nigeria to have a lot of names. Like when you're born, all your aunts and uncles come together and give you a name. So I actually have like a lot more than that, but that's all I actually remember or know. But just day to day, you can call me just Ire, or sometimes I like to go as Rey, like my favorite Star Wars character as well. So, like Haydon mentioned, I write a blog which is called Bits of Code. So you almost missed my joke, which was, this is me as Rey. So, yeah, I'm from Lagos in Nigeria, which is really hot, as you can imagine. When I was coming here, I looked at the weather to kind of see if it was going to be similar, and it seemed to be kind of warm, but when I got here, it started raining. I have a picture about this, but it's not coming up either. Anyway, so I'm a front-end developer. I work at a company called IO. It's based in Germany, actually, and they make AdBlock Plus. That's their main product. But we're also working on other products which are all about trying to help people better monetize on the web. So, yeah, I'm also a writer. I write a blog called Bits of Code, which is basically just about the web in general. I like to write about the core technologies, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So this talk today is about progressive enhancement, and as Haydon mentioned, it's specifically about CSS. So when you hear about progressive enhancement, it's usually you think about JavaScript because that seems to be like the key thing that people tend to be worried about. But there's actually a lot to do with CSS as well, and this is kind of what I'm going to be exploring in this talk. So first of all, what is progressive enhancement? I'm sure we've all heard the term before, but to kind of understand where it came from, we kind of have to go back to its origins, which was in 2003. And this was kind of a bit of a strange year. I actually had to Google, okay, what was popular in 2003, and it was basically a bunch of like R. Kelly songs, Beyonce. But the most popular phone at the time was the Nokia 1100. It was really, I mean, compared to phones now, it was kind of completely crazy. But the state of the web at the time was basically just 1, 2, 3 browsers. Actually, so Safari had only released version 1 at the time. And what we know as Firefox today was a browser which was called Phoenix, and it had a really weird logo, which was of a bird. And Internet Explorer had over like 95% of the market share, so they were really winning at the whole browser war situation. So at the time, not only was there only like a handful of browsers available, there was also only a few versions of each of those browsers available as well. So if you said you wanted to support every single browser that was available, that would be completely feasible. I mean, compared to today. So all you have to do is support version 1 of Safari, version 1 or 2 of Phoenix, and then I think Internet Explorer was on version 6 or something. So it was all very manageable at the time. And so the prevailing practice at that time was something which was called graceful degradation. And this essentially is the practice of building your websites so that you have kind of the optimum great experience for people who are on whatever is the latest browser, whatever is like the best, the newest. And then you also have a slightly less experience for people who are using older browsers or anything that's not like whatever is the majority. And that doesn't sound too bad if you think about it or if you phrase it in this way, but generally the practice was something like this. So you would build your websites and then you would just think, oh, what if someone doesn't have JavaScript? And then you just add this and tell them, go and download Chrome. So a turning point came in March 11th, 2003. And it was something not too unlike Moses coming down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments. But instead of that, it was a guy called Stephen Champion, and he came down with Progressive Enhancement. So he did a talk at South by Southwest at the time. And first, he outlined what the major problems with the whole practice of graceful degradation was. So he mentioned that it doesn't really straddle technology inflection points well. So what he meant was that it doesn't really prepare us for whatever is coming next. It's only a solution about what is the latest and greatest like right now. It doesn't really think too far ahead. He also said that a big problem with the practice of graceful degradation was that designers didn't really think too far back. I mean, graceful degradation, it won't really be an issue if you were thinking, okay, I'm going to support like all the versions back. But typically, designers would just think, okay, I'm going to support whatever is now, and then maybe one browser version previously. He also said that it doesn't really address the needs of different audiences. So graceful degradation is all, like I said, about whatever is the majority or whatever is the most popular, but it doesn't think about different audiences who might have special needs. And he also said it doesn't really think about new alternate devices. So as I mentioned again, it's about whatever is the majority, and it doesn't really think about maybe there's some new technology coming out that should be supported as well. And finally, he said that whatever is good enough usually rules. So the practice of graceful degradation kind of encourages us to just do whatever we think is good enough to suffice, like I showed with the no scripts tag, rather than actually going the extra mile to provide like a really good experience. And then he introduced the concept of progressive enhancement. And he reminded us that the goal of web design isn't to create like a beautiful website, even though sometimes we tend to think that way because that's what we like to do, but it's actually to let people consume whatever content is on your site. So whenever someone comes to, I don't know, like a new site or something like that, they're not going to it to look at how beautiful it looks, even if it is really beautiful. They're going to just read the news. So function or the functionality of it has to always be more prioritized over how it looks. So what does this all mean in practice? And I'm just going to go over some broad guidelines for how to practice good progressive enhancement. So first, we need to make sure that basic content and functionality must be accessible by all web browsers. So whenever you're creating a site or a web application, you need to think whatever is the main purpose of this site, what are users actually coming to do, and make sure that's going to be available to anyone using basically any browser. So a good example of this is the mobile version of Twitter. So they recently redid their whole mobile version of the site, and they used like some cool, I think they used Preact or something. And it's a really great experience, and I think it's a really good example of great progressive enhancement. So when you come to the site, obviously your goal is to look at tweets and to tweet yourself. So you can use it on a desktop browser, and you can use it on a mobile browser, and it looks just as good and it functions just as well. So the second thing is that we should make sure that sparse semantic markup should contain as much content as possible. So this is kind of two things. So first is the semantic markup part. So whenever we're writing our HTML and whenever we're writing our markup, we want to make sure that we're using the correct tags and in the correct order, so the markup itself makes as much sense as possible. And the second part to that is that as much content as possible should be in the actual markup. So you don't want things like a completely empty DOM and then you're just adding things with JavaScript later. You just want to make sure that as much content as possible is in the actual HTML, because ultimately that's going to be the most accessible format for the most people. So the third thing is that enhanced layout can be provided by using CSS. And the keyword here is the enhanced layout part. So you look at CSS as an enhancement rather than something that's required for your site to actually work. So this is what the page looks like without any CSS at all. Obviously, it's not pretty. Nobody wants to actually use this. But if for whatever reason you really wanted to find out how many tweets I've done, you can actually go to the site and you can actually find out that information. Obviously, it's not perfect. This is an example of a tweet that has a massive emoji. But the purpose is that the content is still there and it's still actually usable. And that's just the aim that you're trying to achieve. So the fourth thing is that enhanced behavior can be provided with JavaScript. And again, the keyword here is the enhanced behavior. So we're looking at JavaScript as an enhancement to the site rather than something that's required for it to work. So this is different, or how you approach this will be different depending on the level of complexity of your site. So this is a really simple example. If, for example, you had a restaurant website and you wanted people to be able to search for the latest branch. So without JavaScript, you can just have a simple search box and the person can enter a postcode or an address. But if the person does have JavaScript enabled, then you can have an enhancement. So you can add or use your current location. So you have a base experience that can be accessible for everyone, but then you build on top of it using JavaScript and CSS. Obviously, this is going to differ based on how complex your application is. Not everything is as simple as just adding a one-liner to make it better making it better experience. So the Twitter site did something completely different. So this is what the site looks like if you're using Opera Mini or you just don't have JavaScript enabled. And as you can see, it's completely different. They decided that it would be better for them to just have a essentially completely different site, which is completely stripped back. If you actually look in the markup, they're using table layouts, which I don't even know how they did that, but they managed to do it. So you have a base experience that works for everyone. So if you have a really, really bad network, or you're in a country like where I'm from and you're really concerned about data, you still are able to access the core functionality of the site. But if you're on Wi-Fi or for whatever reason you do have JavaScript enabled, then you have a really a better experience, but you're still able to achieve the same things. So finally, we want to make sure that the user is ultimately able to control their own experience. So whenever you're writing your HTML or CSS JavaScript, we want to make sure to do it in a way that doesn't obstruct the user. So a good example of this is the meta viewport tag. If we want to, we can say that users are not allowed to scale up or down the site at all. But obviously, this is just user hostile. There's no reason to take this, this flexibility or this option away from the user. So that's something that we need to be concerned about, or we need to be aware of when we're using HTML or CSS. So why is progressive enhancement important today? And as we know, 2017 is completely different to how things were back in 2003. And I think it can be summed up as just there's so much more stuff, so much more of everything. So first, we have so many more browsers. And even though we can see here that Chrome has, 54% of the market share, it's nowhere near in comparison to what Internet Explorer had back in the day. So we can't even say we're just going to support Chrome. You have to look at all these different browsers. And besides having to support like 10 or however many different browsers, we have to now be aware that each browser has like at least 10 different versions themselves as well. So it's not good enough to say you're just supporting Chrome 58 or Chrome 60. You have to start thinking, you have to think how far back your users are using different browser versions as well. And we have so many more options on how we want to build. We have so many new frameworks, new technologies. And when we're choosing what technology that we want to use, we have to be concerned about how this is going to work for different users. And there's so many more people online. It's pretty much like quadrupled the amount of people that are online today compared to back then. So if back then you were thinking something like, I don't know, 0.5% of my users need a certain color contrast, it might have been acceptable to think, okay, we don't really need to support those people. But if you have the same percentage today, that's not really a negligible amount of people if you think about the actual amount of people that is. And besides all of this, the web is still completely open, and it's for everyone. So when you build a website, you're not just building it for someone who's like you or someone who's in your country. You're building it for essentially the entire world. So this is a study that I found really interesting. And it just shows how much 500 megabytes of data costs for people in terms of the amount of hours they have to work to pay for it. So if you're thinking about a country like here or Germany, it's only 1 hour of work to be able to use up 500 megabytes of data. So if you go to a site, like having worked in Germany, and for whatever reason it takes up that entire 500 megabytes, it'll be annoying to you, but it's not going to ruin your day or your week. Whereas if you lived like where I'm from in Nigeria, that's essentially like a full working week that you have just wasted. So because of this, the way you choose to build your site actually really matters. And I know sometimes it can seem like, okay, I'm just building a site, it doesn't really matter, like whatever type of site you're building. But if you think about it and you think about the type of people who are going to be accessing your site, you have to be more conscious about how you build it and realize that it's actually costing people their hard-earned money as well. And this is a great quote from Bruce Lawson, who said that we should remember that www doesn't stand for wealthy Western web, it's the entire world. So when we're building websites, we need to be conscious about that. So now to progressive enhancement again. And I just want to go over how it applies to JavaScript and HTML before I go into CSS. So when we think about JavaScript, there are basically two things, broadly speaking, that can go wrong. And the first one is just that JavaScript is not enabled in the browser. So for whatever reason, the person has disabled it, or maybe they're using something like Opera Mini. Or the user does have JavaScript, but they are using some old browser, and it doesn't support a particular feature that you're trying to use. So how do we deal with this? And there are a few things that we can do. So first and foremost, I always try and say that make your website as functional as possible without any JavaScript enabled. And obviously, depending on how complex your site is and depending what the purpose of it is, you have to use your own judgment on how far you go with this. But if there's any critical functionality, consider looking at how you can make it functional without JavaScript enabled at all. Another thing we can do is do feature detection before using any particular features, just so things don't completely break and spoil everything. So for example, if you're building a progressive web app, it's always recommended to check to see if Service Worker is available before you start using it. And we can even take this a step further, and if the browser doesn't support whatever feature it is, for certain things we can add that functionality ourselves with polyfills. So that's simple enough. Obviously, it's a bit more complex than that, but it's kind of straightforward in recognizing what the issue is and what you can do. So with HTML, it's kind of similar. So the main thing that can go wrong here is if you're using some new like HTML tag, maybe one of the HTML5 elements, and the browser doesn't actually really understand what the semantic meaning you're trying to convey from that is. So for example, we can write something like this. We're trying to use header and main to define the layout of the site. But if the browser is, I don't know, some really old browser, it essentially sees something like this. So instead of seeing a header, it just sees a regular div. So how can we deal with this? And essentially, we can add this ourselves using things like ARIA roles. So here we have the equivalent of the semantic meaning of the header tag by using the role banner, and same with the main. So again, this is simple enough. If you use an element like a header, nothing is actually really going to break because the browser sort of has its own inbuilt fallback, but we can still use progressive enhancement techniques to provide pretty much the same experience for users across different browsers. So now we get to the question, what about CSS? And there's a bit of a problem with progressive enhancement and CSS. As we know, CSS is a declarative language, and there are 3 parts to a CSS rule. So we have the selector, the property, and the value. So what happens if something goes wrong with any of these things? So here we have an example, Kanye laughing his ass off. And what we want to do is just like turn the image around, so rotate it 180 degrees. So here's what happens if we have like a faulty selector. Instead of using IMG, we just write out image. And as you can see, the result is basically just nothing happens. Then we have a faulty property. And again, obviously nothing happens. And another one where we have a faulty value, again, nothing happens. And even if we get all of that right, and your user is using a browser like Opera Mini, for example, we get the same effect. Basically, just nothing happens. And that's kind of a problem in a way. And it's a problem because of 2 things. So first of all, unlike JavaScript, we can't just say, okay, if the browser doesn't do this, let's add this feature using like a polyfill, for example. And unlike HTML, it doesn't have sort of like an inbuilt fallback. So it's not like if you use this property in Opera Mini, it's going to do its own version of rotate. Just basically nothing works. And this kind of leads to an issue where when we're working with CSS, it can be a bit of a pain. And you can do things and it just has completely unintended effects and you don't know anything that's going on. So there are a few things that we can do to try and solve this and try and deal with CSS in this way. So as I mentioned before, the markup is the core of your website. So the ultimate progressive enhancement is just to make sure that your site works without CSS at all. And you can do that by having sensible HTML. So I know with features like Flexbox, we can completely rearrange how things work. So if you wanted, you could have your markup be like this for whatever reason. I don't know why you would want to do that, but you can. And it would still, using CSS, it would still appear to be normal. But it would make so much more sense for you to just have something that makes sense in your HTML, and that means you have to write so much less CSS as well. Another thing we can do is take advantage of the cascade. So as we know, CSS is cascading style sheets. And we can use this behavior of CSS to our advantage by building rules on top of each other and sort of treating them as a progressive enhancement. So for example, if you want to create something like a background gradient, we just want to make sure to have a fallback. So first of all, we'll just say the background color should be this, and then we can set a background image using the fairly modern property. So if the browser doesn't understand what this linear gradient is, there's something to fall back on. And this is also the way we use vendor prefixes. So we always put the unprefixed version last, so that because that's what we want the browser to use. And only if the browser doesn't understand that particular property, then you can fall back to a vendor-specific one. A third tip you can use is to use a mobile-first strategy when you're building your sites. So when you're using media queries, try and use ones that are min width versus max width, because this means that you're starting with building a mobile site first and then only building the desktop styles on top of it. So, for example, you can see that if you have an image, for example, and you style it so it fits perfectly on desktop, as you shrink down, it doesn't work at all on mobile. Whereas if you had a image and you made it perfectly on mobile, even though it's not the perfect user experience on desktop, it's still actually usable. So it's better to start with mobile first and build up, rather than to start with desktop and then build down. So this is kind of an example. If you have a mobile style, they also generally tend to be more responsive, because you would tend to use stuff like percentage units when you're on mobile rather than on desktop. So you can have something that would fit any screen size if you just have something that's 100% width. Whereas when you get on larger screen sizes, you might want to have like a specific fixed width, which won't work on a mobile device. Another thing you can do is use Flexbox and CSS Grid. And these were actually designed to be a progressive enhancement. So for example, something that you probably commonly want to do is to have an element that is centered both horizontally and vertically within its parent. And the old way to do this would be using display table cell, and it's not necessarily a great way to do it. But we can use Flexbox, and when we do this, and when we have them defined after the old method, all those other methods will actually be overridden. So it's not like they're going to be interfering with the new styles. So the way Flexbox and CSS Grid are designed, you can use them in the same rules as the old ones, and they're not going to interfere or cause any issues there. And as we probably know, Flexbox and CSS Grid are quite well supported. So Flexbox is pretty much completely supported in all current browsers. And CSS Grid is almost there. Only issue is Opera Mini, which is always the only issue. And another thing you can do, probably more as a last resort, is to just create separate style sheets. So if you have something, if you need to support, I don't know, like IE7 for whatever reason, you might find that it becomes incompatible to try and style both of those in the same style sheets. So you might want to just separate your concerns and have stuff for the legacy styles in one style sheet, and then for the more modern browsers in a different one. So that's kind of the approach that Twitter took here. They just essentially created two separate things so that they can actually have a good experience, a good full-blown experience for both really old browsers or browsers that are really low bandwidth. And then they can also have a really great experience for the more modern ones. So now I'm going to talk about the future of progressive enhancement and CSS. And I'm sure by now you're probably wondering why I haven't mentioned feature queries. And CSS feature queries allow us to create conditional rules, sort of like media queries, but instead of determining what viewports or what screen size, we can actually just determine if the browser supports a particular feature. So it kind of works like this. You do @ supports, and then you have the condition, which is the property value that you want to test if it's available. And then you can now apply your regular CSS rules to it. So there are 4 ways we can use it. So we can just do a simple detection to see if a particular feature is supported. So a very simple one is just checking if Flexbox is supported before you actually start to use it. Another thing we can do is we can chain a bunch of features. So we might only want to apply certain features in combination. So we want to test if font kerning and font feature settings are both available before we apply them. We can do also either or, and this is great for when you're using vendor prefixes. So you want to test if the unprefixed or the prefixed version is available before you use them. And finally, we can also just detect if a feature is not supported at all. So a good way to do a fallback would be to say if if this flexbox is not supported, then you can do the table layout. And yeah, it's pretty perfect, right? It's like what we've all wanted, and it's actually really well supported as well. Even Opera Mini, for whatever reason, it's only IE that doesn't support it. But I mean, that's saying something if Opera Mini supports something, but Internet Explorer doesn't. And obviously, the point of feature queries, the ideal point of them would be if every single browser supported them, so we can really use them and be confident in how we're using them. But even if all browsers don't support them yet, we can still actually use them in a really great way. And Jem Simmons wrote this article, which was how to use feature queries in CSS. This was actually last year, but I think it still applies, even though most browsers now support it. So we're just going to take this example here. We want to check if the browser supports object fit cover before we use them. And there are 4 scenarios that we're concerned about here, so I'm just going to go through each. So the first scenario is if the browser does support feature queries, and then it also supports the feature in question. So in this case, the object fit cover. So this is Chrome. Chrome supports both of those things. And the smiling emoji tells you we're all good. So the second scenario is if the browser does support feature queries, but it doesn't support the object fit cover in this case, for example, Microsoft Edge. And this is also a good scenario for us because what we want is whatever block in between, so the part where we actually apply the style to be ignored, and that's essentially what happens here. And then we have a situation where the browser doesn't support feature queries, but it also doesn't support the feature we're talking about. And that's Internet Explorer. And you might think that this would be a scenario that would be bad for us, but we actually get the intended result that we wanted. So what we wanted was that the feature query block to not be applied. And that's essentially what happens here, even though the actual feature detection never happened. So the only part, which is a bit sad, is if the browser doesn't support feature queries, like Safari, but it actually does support the feature that we're trying to apply. So we would actually want that style to be applied, but because feature queries aren't supported, it's not going to happen. So what's the solution here? And you can probably guess that it's progressive enhancement. So yeah. So what you need to do is think of feature queries themselves as also a progressive enhancement, so we're not dependent on them. So for example, you don't want to do something like this, where you create all your CSS to be dependent on feature queries. So you don't want to say, okay, if it supports this, then add it, but if it doesn't support this, then add something else. Otherwise, none of the CSS will be applied in a case like Safari. What we want to do is just use the same way we've been applying styles, like using media queries and all of that. We never wrap our media queries in a way that nothing is outside the media query block. So that's the same thing we should do with the feature queries. So we have the fallback code, and then only if the browser does support feature queries, then we can have the enhancement. And the good thing about a progressive enhancement way is that we should be completely fine with whatever your fallback is. It shouldn't be something that you just wish never is shown to the user. It should be something that you're happy with, and then the enhancement is only something to make it even better. So what would the world be like in 2030, which is actually a lot sooner than I thought it would be. As you can probably guess, it's going to be more stuff as well. So we're going to have so many more browsers, and we're not even going to know what type of device your users are going to be viewing your website on. I think there are actually browsers on the Android watches, I'm not sure, but your user might be using something like a watch, or they might be using something like a VR headset, and that's a drastically different experience. And you're going to have the same websites that will be adaptable to all of these situations. And we're going to have way more technologies. for all we know, Angular really might be on version 420.5 or whatever. And we're going to have to learn how to deal with all these new technologies while still supporting older browsers. And we're going to have more people online. Not everyone in the world is currently online, so we're still going to have so many more people coming online. And we're not going to be able to decide what type of browser or what type of device they're going to come online in. They might be coming online in whatever iPhone is coming out, or they might be coming online in something that's the equivalent of like the Nokia 1100. So with all this in mind, I just want to leave you with this last quote. And remember that the web is for everyone, so it's not acceptable for us to just leave people behind when we're building our sites. So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ire. That was really good. I saw Jeremy was nodding along, and that's always a good sign. So, another tip actually that occurred to me whilst listening is, as an accessibility consultant, often what I do, the first thing I do when I'm starting to test a site is just turn off CSS, because if the page kind of looks okay, the elements are differentiated because they're semantic elements, so therefore they conform to user agent styles, and the order is okay, so it kind of makes sense from top to bottom, then you're probably all right in terms of screen reader accessibility and stuff too. So it's a good idea to turn your CSS off every so often, and there is actually a day dedicated to that called CSS Naked Day, right? Yeah. So there's a couple of questions here. The first one is from Anonymous. Thank you, wherever you are, Anonymous.
Thank you.
Which is, how much longer or less long does a project take in your experience, presumably one which uses progressive enhancement?
I don't find it actually takes that much longer, particularly because it's more about just building the site in a correct way rather than adding more things. So obviously, when you're first getting started, it will take you some time to realize, like you said, using the right elements and things like that, making sure everything is in order. But I don't think that it actually takes that much time once you've got the hang of it, because, like I said, it's just about building in a different way rather than doing additional steps.
I couldn't agree more. Same with accessibility as well.
Yeah.
If you're using the right elements, it doesn't take any longer to put that element in there.
Yeah.
It's just a different element. And one more question, also from Anonymous, which is, if building for mobile first, would I still target the original iPhone size as the smallest, as a sort of small default, or are there better, more modern sizings nowadays? So I guess they're asking, you know, is there a sort of a baseline which has changed over time?
Mm-hmm. I think it's impossible to know what size. I never really think about a particular screen size. I just try and think as much and as fluid as possible. Obviously, you can't really design for something that will be like 20 pixels wide. So there's obviously going to be a limit, but just think of whatever is the smallest device and try and make sure it doesn't look terrible on that, and then you should be good to go.
Apart from the iWatch, because, you know, that's just silly.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, couldn't agree more. It's there's two expressions, isn't there? There's screen breakpoints and content breakpoints, I think, or something like that. The idea being that content breakpoints is where you put a breakpoint in where it breaks, rather than actually targeting a specific screen size. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think that's it. We've only just had those two questions, and unless there's anyone on the floor who'd just like to quickly, because we have time. Oh, okay. I'll try and get through. Okay.
Sure.
You mentioned that in 2030 you expect there to be many more browsers than today. And in 2003 you said there were about 3 browsers, each with 2 versions, but they were completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And today we have lots of browsers, but they're fairly standardized. Wouldn't it be possible in 2030 that there are maybe many less players and they're all completely standardized, and that progressive enhancement maybe not a problem or another subject anymore? How do you see that?
Yeah. I mean, I think we can all hope that would be the case. I would love for that to be the case. But, I mean, we can never really know. But we can also not necessarily know what devices people are going to be on, because let's say maybe in 20 years, every iPhone has Chrome, or all like the modern devices only use Chrome. We can't really say that some of the older devices or some of the cheaper devices will use the same thing. I mean, like I said, yeah, we would all hope that would be the case, and it would make all our lives a lot easier, but we can't ever be 100% certain that everybody is going to be using it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'll be nice if everyone conformed to certain standards, but not necessarily at the same time have a monoculture where we only have one browser kind of thing, because then obviously change would be difficult too. Okay, so I think that covers everything, and so thank you again very much, Ire, and a big round of applause for her again, please.
Thank you.